Welcome back. We're going into the beginning now. The actual beginning. Before the sun, before the war that split the sky from the ground, before the love that somehow beat death, and before the grief that none of them wrote down directly, that lived in the margins of papyrus, like something the scribes kept starting and then stopping. We're going to move through all of it. The complete mythology. Not as a list, not as a lecture I'm performing at you. The way it was supposed to be taken in the dark, in the stillness, in that place where thought hasn't hardened yet into language. Let your body get heavy. Let the ordinary weight of the day start to lift a little. Before the gods had faces, before anyone had names you could say out loud without feeling strange about it. Before the first temple, before the first priest stood in the grey pre-dawn and lit the first flame and waited to see if it would take. Before all of that, there was only none, just none. Dark water in every direction, which is a description that fails immediately, because there were no directions, no above or below, no edge where the water stopped and something else started. And inside none, coiled the way a seed coils in soil that doesn't know yet it's about to become a field. There was a potential, one possibility. The Egyptians called it Atum, he who is complete, he who came into being by himself. And Atum stirred. I find this part almost impossible to render the way it deserves. He stirred the way a thought moves in the half second before sleep takes you, quietly, almost by accident, as if the universe had simply forgotten to stay still. He didn't open his eyes into light. There was no light. He opened his eyes into more darkness, and that darkness was himself, and he floated in none, this vast conscious thing without a body, this God who was everything, and somehow still had the specific, identifiable ache of not being enough. You have to sit with that. The ache of having everything except a world to put it in. Every being who has ever held power has felt this under the gold and the noise, the terror of the empty room after the ceremony ends. When the throne room clears and the footsteps recede into the corridor, and what's left is silence. Atum felt this before the universe had a word for it. He was the first being ever to feel the weight of loneliness, not because something had been taken from him, not because he'd lost anyone, but because nothing had ever existed to lose. He had never known anything other than himself, and he already knew that wasn't enough. So Atum created. The Egyptians told it differently, depending on which temple, which city, which lineage of priests you were asking. Some said Atum spoke, and the world came from his voice. Some said he wept, and his tears became people. And some, the priests in Heliopolis, in the inner rooms, the version that took decades of initiation before you were allowed near it, said that Atum masturbated into his own hand, and from that act of solitary and desperate need, two gods were born, Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, the two things without which nothing else survives. This is how they understood creation, not as perfect order descending from a perfect height, as desire, as longing, as something alive and imprecise and a little ungainly. The universe didn't come from a plan, it came from need. Shu and Tefnut came out of the dark together, brother and sister, breath and water, and they did what every child does. They wandered off. They drifted into Nun, curious, unafraid, because they were the substance of a god and didn't know yet that anything could harm them. They went far, then farther still, until Atum couldn't sense them anymore. and the silence around him changed quality. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a god alone in the void. It was the silence of a parent who cannot find his children. Atum tore out his own eye, his single consciousness, the shining center of his being, and he sent it into the darkness to search. He stood blind in none, and he waited. I don't have a way to describe that waiting adequately, so I won't try. I'll just say, every moment stretched, every silence had shapes in it. The eye found them. Shu and Tefnut came back, guided through the dark water by the light of their father's own torn-out seeing. And when Atum gathered them back, he wept. His tears fell into the dark, and where they landed, the first human beings came up from the ground, small, confused, frightened. Not his triumph, his relief. The Egyptians kept this. They built it into the architecture of everything. You were made from a god's tears, specifically from the moment he got his children back. Let that settle somewhere. I want to stay with Atum's eye a little longer, because the Egyptians did. The eye they depicted separately from Atum, the Wedjat, the eye of Ra, the autonomous divine seeing that could be sent, could return, could be lost and found and lost again, suggests something they understood about consciousness that took the rest of the world considerably longer to articulate. That the self can extend outside the body. That awareness is not identical to the place it originates from. That you can send the most essential part of yourself into the dark and stand, diminished, waiting for it to come back. And that it might. That sometimes it does. The Egyptians built an entire theology of restoration around the specific hope that what has been sent into darkness can find its way back to the place that sent it. The universe was still almost nothing. Atum, Shu and Tefnut, none beneath all of them, the small frightened humans already asking questions. No sky yet, no earth, no sun, no up, no down. Just the dark water and these few sparks holding on to each other. Shu and Tefnut made children, 2, born from air and moisture, from breath and water. Their names were Geb and Nut, earth and sky, and nothing would be the same. Geb and Nut were born wanting to be pressed together. That's the simplest way I can say it. They came into existence already curled around each other in total embrace. Earth holding sky, sky pressing down against earth. And they would not let go. For an age with no number, for a time so long the water of none got tired of waiting. They held each other. No space between them. No light could pass. Nothing could grow. 2 new gods had arrived, and they loved each other so absolutely that they were making it impossible for existence to continue. Atum looked at his grandchildren and saw the problem immediately. He went to Shu. I need to pause here, because what he asked Shu to do is the thing this whole story turns on, and I want to make sure the weight of it arrives. He asked him to reach into the middle of something that loved itself completely and pull it apart. Shu climbed between them, his feet on Geb, the earth solid, curved, his arms pressed up against Nut, the sky arching, trembling, and he pushed everything he was, every particle of air and breath and space he used to push. And the universe, no, the universe didn't scream. There was no sound yet, not fully. It tore in the way that only separation tears, in the specific, irreversible way that 2 things which belong together make when they're forced apart. Nut arched upward, her body curved away from Geb, her fingers stretching out to every horizon, her spine bending into the great arch the Egyptians would spend thousands of years painting on tomb ceilings. The star-covered woman, the sky itself, the ceiling of the world. And Geb was left below, reaching, still reaching. The mountains were his wanting made solid. The places the earth strains toward the sky, it can't touch anymore. When Geb laughed, the ground shook. Every earthquake, a god who hasn't stopped trying. There's something I find worth sitting with here, in the gap between Geb and Nut. The Egyptians chose this, a separated love, as the precondition for all life. Not a sterile perfection, not a clean beginning, but the ache of two things pulled apart, the space between them, the only place where anything can grow. We exist in the distance between a god's longing and a goddess's reaching. That is the room we live in. Every morning we wake inside the grief of Geb and Nut and call it air. Nut was pregnant. She'd been pregnant before the separation. Now she was separated and pregnant, and Atum, who had already made several decisions of questionable wisdom, looked up at his granddaughter's star-covered belly and felt a new species of concern settle into him. Because Thoth, wisdom, knowledge, the god who knew things about the future before the future had the nerve to happen, had already spoken. One of Nut's children, he'd said, would one day take Atum's throne. One of those unborn gods would replace him. You understand Atum in this moment. You do. The more you have, the more you stand to lose. And Atum had made the universe out of his own substance, had wept people into existence, had made everything from nothing and longing and a terror of silence. Of course, he calculated how much he was willing to surrender. Anyway, he forbade it, commanded that no day in any year would belong to Nut's children. The Egyptian year had 360 days, and Atum wrapped his prohibition around every one of them. No day to be born on. He believed, the way powerful beings always believe, that he could hold back the tide by naming it illegal. Thoth didn't plan around this. I want to be precise about that. Wisdom rarely plans. It moves like water, finding low places, filling gaps. And the gap Thoth found was a game of dice. He played against the moon and won 5 days of light. 5 days that existed outside the calendar's 360. 5 days that belonged to no year and therefore belonged to no prohibition. 5 days that Atum had not thought to claim. So the moon was playing dice with Thoth. That's where we are. Thoth, god of wisdom, of writing, of the cold, strange light that isn't really light, just borrowed sun, challenged the moon to a game. The stakes were fractions of moonlight, literal fractions. Small portions of the moon's total brightness, which the moon couldn't afford to lose, but which pride, then as now, made it impossible to decline. Thoth won. 5 times. He won. 5 times the moon paid in light. A small piece of itself for every loss. That light became 5 extra days. Days that didn't exist in the original calendar. Days in the cracks of the year. The days between days. The days Atum had never thought to prohibit because he hadn't known they would need prohibiting. 5 stolen days. Nut gave birth on each one. On the first, Osiris. On the second, Horus the Elder. On the third, Set. On the fourth, Isis. On the fifth, Nephthys. 5 gods. 5 days. The entire weight of what comes next, born in the margins. I want to spend a long time on Osiris. I notice that about myself every time I come back to this material. I slow down here. I keep adding sentences, and I'm not entirely sure whether it's because Osiris deserves it or because something about him is hard to leave. He was the firstborn, and he arrived like a resolution. Everything the universe had been reaching toward, order, fertility, justice, the green world, seemed to consolidate in him at once. When he walked, the land turned green under his feet. When he spoke, people understood the principle behind the words. Not just the words. He became a king who required no army, no palace guards, no threat. He showed up and was what he was, and the world arranged itself around him. The way. I had a simile here, and I cut it because it was embarrassing. He just was that. Some people are just that. He married Isis, his sister, as gods in Egypt did, because Isis was the only being in existence who was entirely his equal. Isis was the original architecture of the impossible. I mean that precisely. She was the understanding beneath understanding. The wisdom that existed before wisdom had settled into a concept. She loved Osiris the way an element inhabits its nature, completely, without the possibility of being otherwise, without negotiating. There was no version of Isis that didn't love Osiris, and no version of Osiris that wasn't better for it. Together, they made the world cohere. Set watched all of this. Set, the third-born, desert god, stormbringer, the red-haired god of the hot wind, the one whose animal head the Egyptians never agreed on, because Set was the god of things that resist category, that refuse to be pinned into a species. And Set stood at the edge of his brother's brightness and felt something grow inside him, that the desert grows in everything it touches, a patient, consuming hunger. Let me collect the thread here, because Set is the part I always rush and then regret. He was a god of real things. Desert, storm, the violence at the edge of the ordered world. The ancient Egyptians understood this. They didn't worship Osiris and hate Set. They knew the fertile black land needed the desert around it, that the center holds only because the edges are what they are. Set was necessary. Set was the thing that stopped the center from forgetting it was the center. Set was also the younger brother of a god everyone adored. That specific loneliness has no clean name. It lives next to greatness and feels, because of that proximity, more ordinary than it would have felt anywhere else. Set might have been extraordinary in a universe without Osiris. In this one, he was the difficult one, the one the family quietly worried about. He held it for years, for an era. He sat at the feasts, smiled with his unclassifiable face, attended, was present. He held his hunger the way you hold something heavy by pretending it isn't heavy, which works until it doesn't, until it didn't. Anyway, Set built a box. This is the detail I keep coming back to, the one I can't explain why it matters to me as much as it does, but it does. He built a box, a beautiful one, cedar and ebony and gold, inlaid and painted with such precision that anyone who looked at it felt, for a reason they couldn't name, a pull toward lying down inside it. He brought it to a feast. 72 conspirators carried it in. 72 gods and powerful men he'd gathered over the years, each of them carrying their own private grievance, their own hunger, their own version of the story. Set had been quietly, privately telling himself in the dark. He set it at the center of the hall. He announced a game. The box belongs to whoever fits inside it perfectly. Whoever lies down and finds that its dimensions, length, breadth, the specific geometry of their living body match exactly, that person keeps it. 72 people tried. The box was always a little wrong. Too long, too short, a little too narrow. People climbed out and shrugged and reached for their wine because it was a feast, and this was entertainment. Osiris lay down. The box fit him perfectly, because Set had been measuring his brother for months, in morning light, in afternoon shadow, measuring the exact proportion of a body he'd watched his whole existence, and had built the box around those measurements with the patience of a god who had been planning this longer than some civilizations last. I find this... No, I don't find anything. I just keep stopping at this image, and I'm not sure I want to know why. The lid came down. The 72 threw themselves at the seams, poured molten lead into every gap. No air in, no sound out. They lifted the box and carried it through the night, and threw it into the Nile. The current took it. The king of the gods stopped breathing. That sentence doesn't need anything around it. State the fact. Move on. Isis felt it. She felt it the way, all through her, everywhere at once, through everything. She was somewhere else in the world her husband had made green and ordered. And then she felt the silence where his presence had been. She understood it before she had words for what she understood. And she opened her mouth, and what came out was grief that had never existed before, in a form that needed to be made. And she made it. And the sound was something that invented its own language on its way out. She searched, hair loose and wild, barefoot. She walked through the cities Osiris had built, asked everyone, merchants, farmers, fishermen, children in doorways watching the woman with bare feet and impossible grief. The world was full of people who hadn't been watching at the moment everything changed. People with their ordinary concerns, their ordinary days, while the king who made those ordinary days possible floated away on a dark river. Children told her. Children playing at the river's edge had seen the box pass in the night, had seen it on the water, had seen the procession on the bank. She thanked them and followed the river. Anyway, the box had floated to Byblos, a city on the coast of what the Egyptians called the Great Green. It had come to rest at the base of a tree, and the tree had grown around it, over it, through it, around it, with the indiscriminate generosity of living things that don't ask what they are embracing, only that something is present and that growing is what they do. The tree grew enormous, beautiful. The king of Byblos admired it and had it felled and made into a column for his palace ceiling. The body of the king of the gods lay inside a column, holding up a foreign king's roof. The court didn't know. The king didn't know. The column stood there. So there. Isis arrived at Byblos. The grief still on her, the bare feet, the loose hair, and somehow she found her way into the palace, into the queen's confidence, into the proximity of a pillar that contained everything she'd been walking toward. I'm rushing this section, and I know I'm rushing it. Partly because the mechanics of how Isis actually infiltrates the court vary by source, and I don't want to commit to one version. And partly because the rushing itself feels right. She was moving fast. She was not stopping. She had not stopped since the moment she felt the silence. She found him. Inside the tree, inside the column, inside the palace of a king who never knew what he had. She got him out, the body of Osiris, back in the world. Then Set found it, cut the body into 14 pieces, scattered them across Egypt, every piece in a different place, a different nome, a different stretch of riverbank, a different patch of desert. 14 pieces of a god distributed across the geography of the world, like a problem designed to be unsolvable. Isis started again. Isis came to the palace as a servant. She tended the queen's infant son. Each night she held him over a fire, passing him through the flames slowly, deliberately, burning away his mortality layer by layer, the way you strip bark from green wood, transforming him into something that could not die. The queen discovered this, screamed, snatched her child back from the fire, and Isis revealed herself, the full weight of what she was suddenly present in the room, suddenly impossible to look at and impossible to look away from, filling the space the way a sunrise fills a landscape, all at once, leaving nothing unchanged. She asked for the pillar. The king gave it to her. There is no reasonable response to a grief-mad goddess who has just revealed her divine nature by nearly burning your child into immortality, except to give her the thing she wants. Isis took the pillar, opened it, opened the box at its center. She looked at her husband for the first time since the feast. I'm going to stay here a moment because this is the part I find hardest to move through quickly. She stretched herself over his body. She breathed into him and wept over him and kept breathing and weeping, and in the space between his death and his departure, in that thin, fragile air between the world and whatever comes after, something happened. She was the original architecture of the impossible. Even death had limits when Isis decided to push against it. She conceived a child in that liminal place. The child was Horus, her son, the falcon god, the avenger, the one who would come to reclaim what had been taken. That story hasn't arrived yet. Hold it. She wrapped Osiris in bandages. The first bandages. The first act of mummification, performed in a field in the delta, in the tall papyrus reeds at the edge of the Nile, in the wet dark of a night she believed was hers alone. The understanding that a body mattered, that the shape of a person deserved to be preserved with care and intention, that death didn't dissolve the relationship between the living and the dead they loved. She performed the first such ritual in human or divine history, and she did it in a field, alone, in the dark. Set found her. He moved through the dark the way he always moved, fast, purposeful, without apology. He found the body of his brother, and this is where I always feel the story shift register, where it becomes something harder to hold. He cut Osiris into 14 pieces. Some versions say 42. Whatever the number, he scattered them, cast them across the length of Egypt, one piece to each region, as if distributing the death widely enough would make it permanent, as if a thing broken into enough pieces stops being a thing at all. He couldn't have known what he'd done. He couldn't have known that this second act, this scattering, would become the foundation of the most important religious institution in Egyptian history, that every place a piece of Osiris landed would become sacred ground, a center of pilgrimage, a site where temples would eventually be built, and priests would tend fires, and people would walk from the edges of the known world, seeking the presence of a god who was now everywhere at once because he'd been broken into everywhere. Set tried to end the story. He turned it into a map. Isis gathered the pieces. Her and Nephthys, her sister, who was also Set's wife, and who chose in this moment to be her sister's sister rather than her husband's wife. I don't have a way to say how significant that choice is without slowing down considerably, so I'll just say it is significant. Two women moving through the reeds of the Nile Delta at night, through papyrus and dark water, through Abydos and Memphis and Buto and Sais, through all the places that would become the sacred sites of Egypt, searching for the pieces of a man who had been the world. You know this kind of searching, in smaller ways, in your own life, looking for something irreplaceable that you can't quite name, moving through rooms and hours and memories, trying to find the piece that, once gone, makes everything else feel fractured. Isis and Nephthys, moving through Egypt in the dark, are the oldest image of that feeling. I need to pause here. 13 pieces. They found 13. The 14th had fallen into the Nile. The river had carried it to the sea. Fish had eaten it. Even Isis, even the original impossibility, the goddess who had breathed something back into a dead body, could not retrieve it. She made a replacement, from gold, from her own power, from the specific grief of having nearly everything and losing the one piece that changes everything, the piece without which nothing else is complete. Osiris came back. He came back changed. He came back as something that hadn't existed before. The lord of a different kingdom, a kingdom that waited for everyone, that none of the gods had yet named or mapped. He became the king of the dead. He took his restored body and his bandages and his incomplete resurrection and descended into the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, the realm the sun traveled through every night on its way from setting to rising. He sat on the throne of the Duat and became the judge of the dead, the weigher of hearts. Let me collect the thread here, because the Hall of Two Truths deserves its own breath. In the hall, in the presence of 42 divine judges, in the deep place beneath the world where Osiris sat on his throne of absence, the heart of a dead person was placed on a scale. On the other side of that scale, a single white feather, the feather of Maat, truth, balance, the right order of things, the whole accumulated weight of a human life against one feather, a heart burdened with wrong things done, right things avoided. That heart tips the scale, outweighs the feather, and Ammit waits, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile. The three most dangerous animals in Egypt assembled into one creature and given one purpose. She eats the heavy heart and the person stops existing. Not punishment, not suffering, termination. The most Egyptian ending possible for a life not honestly lived. Simple, clean, permanent absence. A heart light as the feather. A heart that had known grief and still chose kindness, had been wronged and still chose something close to justice, had carried the full weight of being human and still managed to hold itself with honesty by the end. That heart balances. It's returned. The person passes through into Aaru, the field of reeds, Egyptian paradise, which was simply Egypt as it was meant to be. Egypt without drought or flood or cruelty. The green and the river and the morning light without end. Osiris's justice, the whole theology of it. I find myself lingering in the feather every time. Not the scale, not Amit, not even the paradise waiting on the other side, but the feather. The fact that they chose a feather, that an entire civilization looked at the weight of a human life and said, this is what it should balance against. Something that light, something that small. I don't know what that says about them or about us, but I kept it. Anyway, above him, in the papyrus marshes of the delta, in the wet and tangled green of Chemis, Isis had hidden herself. A child was growing. Horus was born small and fragile and dangerous in the way seeds are dangerous, in the way the first crack of light is dangerous to a long dark, born secret, born into hiding, while Set sat on the throne of Egypt, wearing the double crown that belonged to someone else, ruling the world his brother had built with all the grinding, costly effort that stolen power always requires. There was a day when Isis left. She had to. Even extraordinary beings hidden from a usurper need to eat, need to move through the ordinary, desperate motions of survival, need to leave the child for an hour. On that day, a scorpion found Horus in the reeds. The sting was real. The child was small. By the time Isis returned, the falcon child was dying. His small body convulsed with a poison that should have had no power over a god, and had it anyway, because Horus was still partly mortal, still partly the fragile thing born in a swamp to a mother in hiding. And the world had apparently decided that wasn't enough suffering yet. It flinches, that thought, like a modern reflex, and I'm pulling it back. The poison worked. He was dying. Isis sat in the reeds with her dying son and lifted a sound that stopped everything. The sun stopped. Ra's solar bark, the great vessel that carried the sun across the sky each day, stopped in its path. The world held still, because some grief is, I want to say, louder than the sun, and I know how that sounds, but I'm keeping it, because even Ra could not continue moving while that sound was rising from the marshes. Thoth came down, ibis-headed, record keeper, inventor of writing, the god who knew the words that other gods didn't know existed. He spoke over the child. The poison retreated, withdrew, unmade itself in the presence of wisdom and precise language. Horus breathed. Isis breathed. The sun moved again. I want to stay here longer than the pace usually allows, because of what stopped the sun was not power. Isis had power. She had more power than almost any god in the system. She had bent death backward and made gold from grief. What stopped the sun was sound. Specifically, the sound of a mother beside a dying child who had already lost everything and could not lose this too. The Egyptians wrote this down. They preserved it. They understood that this particular kind of human moment, the moment of absolute unwillingness to accept one more loss, had force in the universe, had physics. Ra's boat stopped because stopping was the only appropriate response. The sun had the decency to wait. This story survives in hundreds of magical texts, on thousands of amulets carried by thousands of ordinary Egyptians who needed to heal sick children, and who knew, because it was simply part of how they understood the structure of things, that they could call on this moment, that they could invoke the image of Isis in the reeds with her dying child and speak the words over whoever was sick, and the power of that first healing would travel down through centuries and be present in the room with them, then, now. Magic in ancient Egypt was memory, the understanding that the universe had a history and that history could be used, that the stories were structural facts about the fabric of reality, and if you remembered them clearly enough, precisely enough, you could pull on them. Horus grew up. He grew with the speed of something held back too long. The way a river moves when a dam gives, the way spring arrives after a winter that went on past the point anyone believed it would end. He grew in the reeds with his mother's power around him. And when he emerged, he was the falcon god, the hawk-headed young man, the legitimate heir of a throne that Set was currently sitting on in Egypt's palace, maintaining Egypt's borders with the specific, exhausting vigilance of someone who knows the occupation is contested. Horus went before the Ennead, the council of the 9 great gods, the divine tribunal. He presented his case, son of Osiris, rightful king, asking for what was his. Set contested it. He stood before the same tribunal and made his own case with a force that made the gods pause. And I want to give this its weight because it's the part of the story that gets flattened. Set argued that he was the stronger, that he was the god who stood at the prow of Ra's sunboat every single night and fought Apep, the great serpent, the monster of non-being who came howling out of the void to swallow the sun and end the world's daily renewal. Set was the spear in that fight. Who else had the stomach for it? Who else would stand there every night forever against something that could not be reasoned with, could not be healed, could only be fought? The tribunal deliberated for 80 years. 80 years. The gods argued and sent letters and consulted precedents and held conferences and debated divine law while Horus maintained his claim and Set held his position, and the world conducted its uneasy business without a clear Sky King. I find something almost, I don't know, there's something in the 80 years that I keep returning to when I read this material, the sheer duration of it, the institutional paralysis of divine governance. I'm not going to finish that thought. They fought in the court, in the water, in the sky. Set tore out Horus's left eye. Thoth healed it. The healed eye became the Wedjat, the eye of Horus, the most reproduced protective symbol in Egypt's entire visual vocabulary, on every tomb wall, on every boat, on every amulet pressed into the hands of every child, the symbol of restoration, of what can be returned even after it's been taken. I want to pause at the Wedjat for a moment, because the Egyptians did. The eye that was torn out and healed and became the most powerful symbol of protection in their entire civilization. They chose that. Not the uninjured eye, not a perfect eye that had never been touched by anything. The healed one, the one that had been through the worst thing and came back. Every sailor who painted the eye on the prow of his boat was not invoking an eye that had been kept safe. He was invoking an eye that had been destroyed and returned. There is a theology of survival in that choice that I find myself unable to move past quickly. The wound was part of the power. In the end, a letter. Osiris sent a letter from the Duat to the tribunal, the king of the dead who had been waiting, who could have spoken at any moment but had chosen the dignity of patience, the patience of someone who knows the truth will eventually become unavoidable, sent a letter. No rage, no threat. He simply asked in the measured tone of a man who has been listening carefully for a very long time, why it was taking so long to do the obvious thing. He reminded the tribunal that it was his crops that fed them. The wheat and barley that grew from his resurrection, from the Nile's flooding that reenacted his death and renewal each year, his abundance that kept the gods alive. He wanted to know what became of a tribunal that denied justice to the son of the god who fed it. The tribunal gave Horus the crown. I need to pause here because what happens to Set matters enormously, and it's easy to rush past it toward the cleaner ending. Set was stripped of the throne. Set was placed at the prow of Ra's sunboat. Every night, in the dark beneath the world, when Apep came from the void, Set would be there, with his spear, his storm. His violence pointed outward at the thing the universe needed violence to survive. He wasn't destroyed. He wasn't erased. The Egyptian universe required both things, the ordered green world of Horus's kingship and the brutal necessary edge of Set's protection. The wheat and the desert, the black land and the red land. Any kingdom that imagined itself as only one thing was a kingdom that didn't understand itself yet. Horus took the throne, living king, and the theology reaches forward here into every generation that would ever inhabit Egypt, touches each one directly, because Horus was the principle of living kingship. Every pharaoh who sat on Egypt's throne was Horus in life. The falcon, the sky lord, the heir, and every pharaoh who died became Osiris, became the king of the dead. Every death a becoming, every ending a transformation. And the Nile flooding each year was the continuous renewal of the promise that death didn't end a god's relationship with his world. So there. Anyway, Ra. Ra was already ancient when Geb and Nut were separated. Ra, who held in his many names and many forms the entire complexity of solar theology. The morning sun called Khepri, the young scarab rolling the sun up over the horizon. The midday sun called Ra, the full blaze. The evening sun called Atum, the complete one, the first god cycling back to his original form at the day's end. Three faces, one light, the same energy in continuous transformation through a single day's arc. Ra crossed the sky in his solar boat, dayboat east to west across the blazing noon of creation, and then at the western horizon, he descended into the Duat, through the 12 hours of the night, through 12 provinces of the underworld. Something required of him in each one, something to witness or perform or simply endure on his passage back to the east. There is a version of Ra that the popular imagination skips past, and I don't want to skip it. The old Ra, the Ra who grew ancient. The myth says there came a time when Ra's bones were silver, and his flesh was gold, and his hair was lapis lazuli. Not metaphors for beauty, not decorative excess, but the specific image of a god becoming mineral, becoming less living thing and more monument. He had been so long in the business of sustaining the world that the world had gradually, without asking permission, begun to sustain itself on him, feeding on his presence the way roots feed on stone. The people he had made, who owed their existence to his tears, had started treating him as furniture, as background, as given. And Ra, who had been the first light and the central fire, who had burned at the noon of the world for longer than memory reached, Ra sat on his throne and felt the particular exhaustion of a being who has been necessary for so long that necessity has curdled into invisibility. This is the Ra who turned on humanity. Not the strong Ra, the tired one. In the deepest hour of the night journey, Ra's boat reached the chamber where Osiris lay, the meeting of the living sun and the dead king, the fusion of solar energy and whatever Osiris had become beneath the world. In that brief meeting, and I'm not sure I can describe this adequately, I've tried several times in notes and it keeps escaping the sentence. Ra poured light into Osiris, and Osiris poured resurrection back into Ra, and the exchange lasted only a moment, but that moment was the engine of everything, the invisible heartbeat inside the visible world. One charged the other renewed the one. The sun could continue, Osiris could persist. Both required the other to go on existing. Then Apep, the great serpent, the world snake, the force of non-being that lived in the deepest dark of the Duat and attacked the sunboat every night, without exhaustion, without the possibility of final defeat, because Apep was pure structureless force, a thing that cannot be killed, only repelled night after night after night into an eternity that has no final victory in it. The Egyptians knew this. Every night in every temple, priests performed rituals to curse Apep, write his name on papyrus and burn it, spit on him, bind him in chains of words. The rituals worked. The sun rose each morning as proof, and had to be performed again the next night, and the night after, and the night after that. Think about what it requires to fight something that cannot be killed. The same battle every night at full force, knowing it will never be finally won, knowing the serpent will come again tomorrow, and you will be there again with the same spear, and it will not have learned anything, and neither will you. Not in the way that changes the outcome, only in the way that makes you better at the work of holding. The Egyptians put the god of chaos in charge of fighting chaos. The recognition that only something which contains the darkness knows how to face it, that you can't fight what you don't, in some necessary way, already understand from inside. Every morning the sun rose, every morning the proof. The light came back over the eastern horizon like a debt repaid on time, every time without fail, which is a strange way to put it, and I'm leaving it anyway because the feeling is right, even if the image is slightly off. Every morning. Now Thoth, we have already seen him, healing Horus in the reeds, winning the 5 days from the moon, keeping the records of the divine tribunal for 80 years of deliberation. To see him only there is to miss him entirely. Thoth was the intelligence of the universe, the mind behind the order, the measuring and calculating and recording faculty without which none of the other gods' stories could cohere, without which the dead couldn't be judged because there was no record of their lives to judge them by, without which the gods couldn't communicate, because language itself was his, invented or discovered, or simply embodied, depending on which temple, which tradition, which century you were asking in. He was the ibis-headed god, the bird with the curved beak that moves through shallow water like a pen moving through a papyrus. I notice I like that image too much and have now used it twice across different drafts of this material, which probably means I should retire it, but here it is again. He was also the baboon, the animal the ancient Egyptians had watched sitting in early morning light, facing east, arms raised toward the rising sun, with what looked to human observers unmistakably like devotion. The baboon who greeted the dawn, the ibis who wrote everything down. Both of these were Thoth, The doubling makes sense if you stay with it. Wisdom both worships what it cannot fully explain and records with precision what it can. The two gestures together, that's the whole thing. Thoth invented writing. He kept the records of the Hall of Two Truths. The divine secretary, the one who wrote down every verdict, every feather's measurement, every soul's outcome in a ledger that exists somewhere beneath the world and has been continuously updated for longer than we have language to describe. He was the mediator in every divine dispute, and the reason he could mediate was that his opinions served truth rather than any particular party. He had no stake in outcomes except the correct one. He was also the moon, the god of measurement and recording, governing the body in the sky that gave you the months, that told you where you were in the year, when to plant, when to harvest, when the flood was coming. The moon as calendar. The moon is the tool that made civilization possible, that allowed cities to exist because the people in them could agree on when to do things. Thoth was that agreement. He was the shared coordinate system without which everything else falls apart. There are those who find Thoth the most quietly extraordinary of all of them. I am one of those people, and I'll admit it. He isn't the most dramatic. He isn't the most beloved. He doesn't get the temples Bastet gets, or the devotion Isis gets. But the universe is full of things happening, and Thoth was the thing that made it possible to say what happened. Everything else requires him to have already done his work. And there is something further, something I keep approaching and then setting down. Thoth's loneliness is of a very specific kind. The loneliness of the one who records everything and is recorded by no one. Every other god's story is in his ledger. Every feather measurement, every divine verdict, every name. He wrote it all down. And somewhere in that ledger, there should be a page for Thoth himself, a record of what it cost him to be the mind that held it all. I've looked. The Egyptians didn't write that page. Or if they did, it hasn't survived. Maybe wisdom understood that the cost is beside the point. The record is the record. The ibis moves through the shallows and writes what it finds and keeps moving. Hathor. Let me try to do this properly. Hathor has been reduced in the way that large things get reduced when they pass through the filter of a civilization that doesn't share the original assumptions, to a cow-headed goddess of love and beauty, which is accurate, the way describing the ocean as wet is accurate. Hathor was everything that made life worth preserving, the original life force, the most ancient of the feminine divine powers, the golden goddess who contained a vitality so total that the universe needed her to be several things simultaneously just to hold it. She was the goddess of love and desire, the electricity between two people that makes the ordinary world suddenly unbearable to occupy alone. She was the patron of music, which is love's particular language. Dance, which is the body knowing joy before the mind has had a chance to argue it out of the feeling. Drunkenness. And I want to stay here a moment because this gets misread. Drunkenness as sacred technology, as the most ancient human method for reaching the divine by temporarily suspending the part of the self that insists on staying separate from everything. These were all hers. They were all versions of the same thing. She was also the Eye of Ra. This changes everything else about her. Early in the universe's history, something went wrong between Ra and humanity. The humans had started treating the sacred as ordinary. They'd grown comfortable, Ra, in the way of old kings, in the way of all power that watches itself being taken for granted, decided to act. He sent his eye out into the world. His divine judging power took the form of Hathor, and Hathor went out as Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess, the burning one, because Hathor and Sekhmet were the same force at different temperatures, the same life power that becomes destruction when it decides what it loves is being harmed. Sekhmet moved through humanity like fire through dry grass. She was extraordinarily effective. Too effective. She was killing everything. Let me stay with Sekhmet because she deserves the space. She wasn't evil. This is the thing that gets lost. Sekhmet was precisely what Ra had asked for. His own eye, his own divine seeing, turned to its purpose. And the purpose was to correct, to restore, to burn away what had grown wrong. The problem was not that she was wrong about what needed correcting. The problem was that she was right, and rightness at full force, without any mediating mercy, without any capacity for enough, will consume everything. She looked at humanity and found what she was looking for and kept looking, kept finding, because there was always more, because there is always more. Every civilization that has ever acted in the name of pure principle, without the softening of an appeal to what survives the principle, has been Sekhmet, burning and certain, and in the burning, undone. The gods brewed beer. 7,000 jugs, the myth says, an amount that has always made me pause, the specificity of it 7,000, as if someone counted. Dyed red with ochre and pomegranate juice, and poured across the fields where Sekhmet was working. She saw it, and it looked like blood, and she drank it. All of it. She drank until the violence went out of her like a tide going somewhere else, until Hathor came back through the mask and sat in the stained field, blinking, coming back to herself slowly, the way all of us come back from our worst moments, confused, a little ashamed, in need of rest more than anything else. The Egyptians celebrated this every year, the Festival of Drunkenness, the great sacred party, the date in the calendar when everyone drank too much in honor of the moment when civilization was saved by sufficient quantities of red beer, when losing your ordinary self was an act of divine participation, when becoming undone was how you honored the day the cosmos chose to remain whole. I keep thinking about what it means that they built this into the official sacred calendar, the institutional, state-sponsored, priest-sanctioned Festival of Drunkenness. Something about that. It surfaces like a reflection, and I pull back from finishing the thought, because the comparison wants to form, and it doesn't belong here. But the instinct toward it is right. They understood something we've lost the formal language for. I need to pause here and collect the thread, because we need to go to Nephthys, and Nephthys deserves attention she almost never receives. The last-born, Set's wife, the one who chose her sister over her husband when the world required a choice. She is sometimes described in the text as the goddess of nothing, she who has no domain, no specific territory, no obvious function, the goddess of the threshold. This is described as a deficiency in her, and it is the opposite of a deficiency. Nephthys is the goddess of the edge, the space between categories, between life and death, between the visible and the invisible, between what can be spoken and what can only be known. She stands at every threshold, the moment before a decision, the night before a departure, the hour before grief fully arrives. And she is what you feel there, the something in the air that is witness, just witness. Not comfort, not warning. She and Isis together, the two kites, the mourning birds of Egyptian funerary imagery, two women with birds' wings standing at the head and foot of every sarcophagus, holding the space between a person's last breath and their first moment in the hall of Maat. For 3,000 years, they held that space. They are holding it now in the sealed stone rooms where the dead still lie in their wrappings. Nephthys had a child with Osiris. The myth is indirect about how. It says she disguised herself as Isis, or that Osiris was drunk, or simply that it happened in the way things happen in divine stories, without the explanation a human story would demand. The child was Anubis, the jackal-headed god, the embalmer, the guide of the dead through the darkness that follows. Isis raised him. This detail, I'm not sure I can say why it matters to me as much as it does, but I've kept returning to it across everything I've read on this material. Isis raised the child of the moment that was her husband's betrayal, and she raised him well, and he became one of the most important gods in the entire system. The god who walks with the dead through judgment was raised by the goddess who refused to let death be final. What Anubis knew about the dead, he learned in her shadow. Let me spend a moment with Anubis himself. He deserves that. He tends to be depicted, and he tends to be passed. The jackal, the scales, the weighing, without anyone asking what it was like to be him. The god of embalming, the god of the threshold, between the living world and the dead one. He was the first one to wrap Osiris in bandages, his hands doing what his mother had started, carrying forward the original act of care. Every embalmers in Egypt who wore the jackal mask and bent over a body, working with linen and resin and the ancient precise rituals of preservation, they were Anubis. They understood themselves to be Anubis, not imitating him, not invoking him, being him in that moment, in that room. The sacred and the practical were not different categories. Care for the dead was prayer. Prayer was care for the dead. Anyway, there are so many more. The divine world of Egypt is dense in the way that the very old forest is dense. Things growing through other things, roots tangled at every depth, light coming down in unexpected places. Ptah, the god of Memphis, who created the world through thought and speech, through the internal act of conceiving something perfectly in his mind and then speaking it into being. The patron of artists, of craftsmen, every sculptor lifting a chisel, every painter mixing pigments, was repeating the original creative act, a small echo of the moment when a god thought the world into existence. Khnum at his potter's wheel at the first cataract of the Nile, shaping each human body and each human soul from clay simultaneously. The body and the car, the vital essence, shaped together, fired together, sent into the world together. Not souls dispatched from a distant heaven into vessels. A god at a wheel, hands in clay, personally shaping you, your hands, your face, the specific way grief moves through your particular body. Personal. The word the myth keeps insisting on is personal. Bastet, cat goddess, daughter of Ra. the gentle face of the same solar power Sekhmet expressed at full heat. She protected the home. Her temple at Bubastis drew hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, kept thousands of sacred cats, hosted the largest festival in the Egyptian calendar. I'm moving through her quickly, and I'll notice it, and it's partly because the cat goddess material is everywhere in popular culture, and I'm impatient with my own impatience, but there it is, Amun, the hidden one, the invisible wind, the god whose name meant concealed, whose presence filled everything precisely because he couldn't be seen. Over the long arc of Egyptian history, he became something close to what other traditions would call the one god, the primordial divine force behind all the other forces, the face behind all the faces. And he did it while remaining, by definition, invisible, the god of hiddenness as the most powerful god. There's something in that structure I find myself turning over even now, writing this at an hour when I should have stopped an hour ago. 3,000 years. The Egyptians worshipped these gods for 3,000 years. And that number requires a pause before you continue. A real pause, not a rhetorical one. The time between us and ancient Egypt is roughly 2,000 years. Dynastic Egypt spans longer than that. The same gods across that entire enormous length. Names shifting, faces merging, cities rising and conquering each other and synthesizing their theologies into new forms, but the same essential gods underneath it all. The same falcon in the sky, the same scales in the hall beneath the world, the same feather on one side, the same green man in his bandages on his throne in the dark, patient as stone, waiting for the sun to pass through again. We know about them because they wrote everything down. Papyrus is fragile, and most of it is gone, but they also wrote on stone, on walls, on the insides of sarcophagi, on tomb ceilings, on the faces of temples cut from granite and limestone that were built to outlast memory itself. The pyramid texts are the oldest religious writings in human history, carved inside the pyramids of the Old Kingdom over 4,000 years ago, written for the dead king's use in navigating the Duat, full of spells and hymns and practical instructions for which gate requires which password and how to convince 42 divine judges that your heart is as light as the feather. The people who wrote them were civil servants, priests and scribes who had devoted their careers to making sure the dead arrived where they were going. The pharaoh was the hinge between the human world and the divine world. Horus while alive, Osiris when dead, and in some theological traditions, both simultaneously while on the throne. The legitimate heir, the divine son, the one whose proper rule kept Maat alive in the human realm. A kingdom with a bad king was cosmologically dangerous. The fabric that held the universe together ran through the throne. A bad king didn't just fail his people, he frayed something structural. Over the centuries, the afterlife technology reserved for kings began to move outward. The pyramid texts became the coffin texts, written on the insides of non-royal coffins. The coffin texts became the Book of the Dead, not a single text, but a collection of spells and maps and guides that any Egyptian with sufficient means could commission from a scribe and take into the tomb as a practical guidebook. The field of reeds opened. Anyone whose heart, at the end of life, was light enough. This is the quietly revolutionary thing that happened in the middle of Egyptian theological history, and I find myself wanting to slow down here because it tends to get rushed past in favor of more dramatic material. What changed was the question of who was eligible, and the answer became anyone. The gods didn't change. Maat didn't change. The weighing didn't change. The criterion was the same feather it had always been, and the feather didn't care about your title. Death as the great equalizer, but fairly, precisely fairly. The scales don't have politics. Now, the question the ancient priests raised in their innermost chambers and never fully answered, whether the gods were afraid, not of Apep, not of each other, whether they were afraid of what their own stories told them about the nature of power. Because every throne in Egyptian mythology was stolen, contested, or had been through fire before it could be sat on with any security. Atum feared his grandchildren. Ra grew old and turned on the humans he had made. Osiris died. Horus waited 80 years for what was already his. The gods were magnificent, and the texts whisper this. The texts do not announce it. They were afraid. Afraid the way everything is afraid that has something to lose. Afraid the way every parent is afraid who has a child in the world and knows the world contains Set and contains Apep and contains the dark water of none pressing at every edge. You understand this in your jaw, in your stomach, in the tightness behind your sternum. The gods of Egypt were afraid because they loved, because love and fear live in the same house, because love is always, at its ground, the specific terror of losing what you love, and any god who loved anything was carrying the weight of potential loss everywhere, always. Isis carried it most visibly. She carried it in the reeds of Chemis, wrapping her son in protection and in her absolute refusal to let what happened to Osiris happen to Horus. She carried it the way only those who have already lost everything can carry the fear of more loss. Not with false detachment, not with the performed wisdom of someone who has decided attachment is the problem, but with full, open, completely awake tenderness. She had lost and knew it could happen again, and refused to love less because of it. I think this is the deepest courage in all of Egyptian mythology, and I'll hold that claim, even though I can't fully defend it in a form that would satisfy a scholar. It just feels true in the way that some things feel true before they've been argued. Set at the prow with his spear is courage of one kind. Isis in the marsh, holding nothing back, is a different kind. The kind that has already seen the worst outcome and continues anyway. While you've been listening to all of this, I'm curious which of these gods you found yourself drawn toward. Let that thought sit. Let it drift. I need to collect the thread. Maat, the principle before the goddess, or the goddess as the principle, because in Egypt those were the same thing, because the Egyptians understood that principles require bodies to be real, and so they gave truth a body and called it Maat, and gave her a white feather for a crown, and depicted her with wings spread wide as if she were holding the whole universe in the span of them. Maat was truth. She was the truth of the universe's proper functioning, the principle of right order, the alignment of human behavior with the nature of things, not morally in the simple rules list sense, but in the deeper sense of coherence. When Maat was present in a kingdom, the floods came at the right time. Crops grew. When Maat was absent, the floods were too high or too low. The harvests failed. The courts were corrupt. and the strong took from the weak. Maat was a diagnosis. You either had it, or the evidence said you didn't. In the Hall of Two Truths, when the dead person recited the negative confession, the list of wrongs they had not committed, they were reciting their alignment with Maat. I have not lied. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not caused suffering. I have not cheated in weights and measures. That last one, I keep stopping on that one. The ancient Egyptians placed marketplace fraud on the same level of divine offense as killing. The economy was a moral system. The way you treated the person on the other side of a transaction was a theological matter. It flinches this observation towards something contemporary. And I'm pulling back, but the shape of it stands. The transaction was sacred. The counterparty was sacred. The scale in the marketplace echoed the scale in the hall. Maat was also, in ways that the formal texts somewhat understate, the condition of Osiris's continued existence in the Duat. He could only judge because she provided the measure. He could only weigh because she was the feather. In some sense, she was not beside him in the hall. She was the hall. She was the process itself, given wings and a name. The Egyptians kept this distinction clean and then let it blur in exactly the right places, the way all useful distinctions eventually blur when you push them far enough toward the truth they're trying to describe. What does your heart weigh right now? In the quiet of wherever you are, the Egyptians believed you knew that the heart kept its own honest account, separate from the narrative you built around your choices, separate from the elaborate internal justifications that consciousness constructs to stay comfortable. The heart knew. At the end, in the hall, there would be no arguing with it. The feather would be exactly as heavy as it was. The scales would simply tell the truth. This is, if you've lived with some care, a relief. The promise that the accounting will finally be accurate. The ancient Egyptians who built their ethics around the feather were people living in orientation toward the weighing, using it as a compass, asking themselves in the daily small decisions whether this choice adds weight or keeps it light. Anyway, the night in Egypt was a world. The Duat, the underworld, the place Ra traveled, where Osiris ruled, where the dead gathered and waited and were judged and either continued or ended. A complete civilization running in parallel to the day, with its own geography, its own inhabitants, its own laws. The sun set in the west, direction of the dead, funeral processions crossed to the west bank of the Nile. Tombs were built on the west bank, and the sun rose in the east, direction of the living, of birth, and beginning and return. Every single day, the world demonstrated the central claim of Egyptian theology, which is that things go down and they come back up again. Things die and they return. The energy of them, the car, the vital force, joins the current and flows on. The stars were the souls of the dead. The Milky Way was the celestial Nile, the river of heaven along which the dead traveled. The sky was a text. Every night a new page of the same story, written in light, read by everyone who ever looked up, which is everyone who has ever lived. When the Egyptians aligned their pyramids with certain stars, when they oriented temples so that at a specific moment in the year the rising sun would travel through the entrance corridor and illuminate only the face of the god in the innermost chamber. When they did these things, they were maintaining connections, holding the threads between the human world and the divine world, making sure the communication stayed open. The priests were the people whose job was to keep the universe talking to itself. This is perhaps the most human thing about the Egyptian gods. They needed maintenance. The statues in the innermost sanctuaries were fed, bathed, dressed, perfumed every day because the gods were real presences in those forms, and real presences need real care. The divine and human were in the same world, breathing the same air, and the relationship required daily attentive practical tending. I find this, I want to say beautiful, but the word doesn't carry the right weight. Grounding, maybe. The gods required groceries. The sacred was an ongoing relationship, not a state you achieved and kept. The Egyptians worshipped these gods for 3,000 years through the Old Kingdom, which built the pyramids, the Middle Kingdom, which produced the finest literature, the New Kingdom with its great temples and its wars and its dense, complex theological syntheses. They worshipped in cities and fields and desert outposts and on boats moving up and down the Nile, at morning and midday and sunset, and in the deep of the night. They included their gods in legal contracts and medical diagnoses and love poetry. Some of the most beautiful love poetry in human history. These small personal documents full of gods walking through the ordinary moment of someone in love, present, attending, real. Alongside the heart in the tomb was a heart scarab, a carved stone beetle placed over the chest, inscribed with a spell addressed to the heart itself. O my heart of my mother, O my heart of my different forms, do not stand against me as a witness. Do not oppose me in the judgment hall. The dead person speaking directly to their own heart, asking it, or perhaps begging it, not to contradict them before the tribunal. This is extraordinary, and I need to stay here longer than the pace of this narrative usually allows. The Egyptians knew the heart would tell the truth. What they hoped was that the heart would tell it gently, that the person standing before the 42 judges was doing their best with the complicated mess of an actual human life and deserved, if not mercy exactly, then something like the benefit of silence where silence was possible. The heart scarab was a prayer for mercy from one's own most honest self. Every person buried in Egypt with that carved beetle on their chest was carrying the hope that the truth of their life would be told kindly, heard fully, condemned for nothing that was genuinely human, found worthy of continuation, that the final accounting would have some tenderness in it, that the scales, while honest, would be held by hands that understood what it cost to be alive. This is what the Egyptian gods gave the civilization that worshipped them. They didn't promise certainty. They knew better than that. They knew what Apep could do, what Set could do, what the desert and the flood and the scorpion sting could do. They gave a framework for understanding cycles, a cosmology in which loss was, not reversed exactly, but metabolized, a theology in which the heart's truth was the ultimate measure, a daily practice of attention and care and offering, a way of inhabiting life in which the sacred was woven through the ordinary, present in every meal and every field and every morning. I need to pause here, because there's a question I've been carrying through this whole material, and I want to put it down somewhere. Did Osiris ever forgive Set? The myth doesn't answer it. The tomb walls don't answer it. The papyrus scrolls are silent at exactly that point, in the space where you most want them to speak. The priests who spent their lives tending the divine presences in the innermost sanctuaries either didn't know or didn't write it down, or understood that some truths live in silence, and writing them would kill them. Maybe the question is the answer. Maybe the act of asking it, looking at a story of destruction and asking whether the God who was destroyed carried anything in his heart beyond the event, is already its own kind of wisdom. The question of forgiveness is private. It takes place in rooms that can't be mapped, in hours with no number, in the part of consciousness that is neither the weigher nor the weighed, but the awareness that holds both. The ancient Egyptian word for that interior space was the ib, the heart, the organ, but also what the organ was understood to contain, the interior self, the part of you that Maat was interested in, that held the truth of your life before you had words for it, that would rest on the scales. And I notice now, at this hour, having come all this way through the material, that the heart scarab was also a small stone beetle, a scarab, Kepri, the morning sun, the thing that pushes the light back over the horizon, placed directly over the heart. The Egyptians hid the sun inside the chest, in the specific place where the weighing happened, the renewal symbol pressed against the organ of truth. I'm not sure whether that was deliberate or simply the kind of resonance that accumulates over 3,000 years of careful attention. Both of those options are interesting to me. Maybe Set and Osiris are there, in the IB of each other, in the weight of a relationship that can't be filed as pure grievance or pure forgiveness, that persists in the dark below the world, the way all complicated loves persist, held the way the two kites hold the dead, held the way Nut holds the sky, arching above everything, fingers at every horizon, body blazing with stars. That last image, I know I've used it already in this material, and I'm using it again because I haven't found anything better, and at this point in the night I'm not going to. Anyway, what became of the world? The world made from a god's loneliness, separated from its own sky, seeded with the tears of reunion and the pieces of a murdered king. It continued. It continued the way things structured around continuation always continue, by returning, by renewing, by flooding and receding and planting and harvesting and dying and being born, by the sun setting and rising, by the great weighing in the great hall, by the dead journeying through the hours of the underworld with the solar bark, and the priests at dawn opening the sanctuary doors, and the farmers watching for Sobdet. Sirius, the brightest star, associated with Isis, rise at dawn after its seasonal absence, knowing that the Nile flood was coming, the green was coming, another year beginning in the same pattern that had always been the pattern. It continued the way love continues, in different forms, with its seasons of grief and its seasons of abundance, with Set at the edge and Apep in the dark, and the honest terror that is inseparable from honest love. It continued because the people keeping it going understood that continuation required daily, careful, devoted work, that the sacred didn't stay sacred without tending, that the gods needed the offerings, truth needed the priests, the dead needed the rites, the living needed the myths, and the children, every generation of children, needed to be told again about the box that fit one man perfectly, and the woman who walked barefoot through the world to find him, and the child growing in the reeds to reclaim what had been taken, and the judge who weighed the heart in the dark and gave back to the light-hearted the only thing that ever mattered, the world, love, the morning. We return now to where we began, to the darkness before the first darkness, none the vast original water, Atum floating in it, blind for a moment, while his eyes searched the dark for his children. Shu with his feet on the earth and his arms on the sky, pressing them apart, holding the space that we live in. Isis in the reeds, Thoth on the night wind, Osiris with his bandages and his patience and his scales. And then back here, gently, to the dark that is this dark, the specific dark of this moment, this room, this breath. The Egyptian gods survive the way truths survive, in the weight of something genuinely understood, in the specific gravity of a story that was true enough to be told for 3,000 years without losing its charge. They survive in the question of what your heart weighs, in the impulse to build something in the middle of the desert, just to say, we were here and we tried to understand, and what we understood we carved into stone. Let the weight of all of it settle. Let the falcon find its thermal. Let the ibis stand in the shallows. Let the sun finish its passage through the dark kingdom and find the eastern horizon, and remember how to rise. Something in you knows this rhythm. Something older than the part of you that learned to worry. Let that something hold the watch. If this story carried you somewhere, the next journey goes to ancient Mesopotamia, to Gilgamesh and Enkidu and the great walls of Uruk, to the oldest friendship in recorded history and the grief that turned a king into someone trying to understand. To be there for it, all you have to do is come back. Good night.